Hello and welcome to Intentism Shows. This is the official podcast of the Intentism movement, and we are comprised of artists and writers and philosophers and actors, many people, but we all maintain one thing, and that is that all meaning is the imperfect outworking of intention. That's all meaning is the imperfect outworking of intention. Well, let's crack on. We'll start off as always with "Can I have your intention, please?" I'd like to think of a thought experiment here. Can you imagine a painting of yours in a frame? You're the artist, maybe a sculpture, and it's been now received by the press, by critics, and they all maintain one thing, and that's that your work is racist. Your work is racist. Now, how would you feel? You might be able to argue, or the press might think that the context of the work might suggest it's satire. There's a lot of comedy shows in particular where the lead character might be racist or prejudiced about something, but the format of the show is to mock that particular person, and no one generally says that the writers or the artists or the actors are racist or offensive in that particular way, and I'm sure you can think of various satirical comedy shows like that. But what if it's not that apparent in the context? Well, maybe then you say, well, the artwork is racist. But what if that was your artwork? Perhaps you'd like to think differently. Perhaps you'd like to say, well, listen to what the artwork was meant to be about. Hear my intention. Hear me out. Hear what I was trying to do with it. Then maybe I didn't realize it appropriately. Maybe my skills weren't appropriate enough for that intention to be realized in a way that made sense to people. But have a think. I do think that many of you would say, well, I don't want to stand back and be told my artwork is racist, even though I'm happy to say the artwork is separate from the author. When it's down to me and how people relate to my artwork, I want to speak up. But what if the artist has been gagged? What if the artist is no longer alive? What if the artist is dead, the writer is dead, like Roland Barthes said in his famous text, The Death of the Author in 1967? Then you wouldn't be able to say anything. So there you go. There's my little thought experiment for "Can I have your intention, please?" We're going to move on to Critical Corner now. And last week we looked at Gadamer and Heidegger, and we looked at Truth and Method, and various works that Gadamer was writing, and how he spoke about the fusion of horizons that then was used by Heidegger in many of his discourses and writings. And the idea of the fusion of horizons is relatively simple, although it can become very complicated when you dig deeper in it. But it's the idea that we bring baggage to a work. We won't be able to look at it objectively when we create it, and we won't be able to look at it objectively when we look at it as a viewer. And the only way we can understand a work is when there's a fusion here of the actual artwork and the horizon, in the sense that the work can constantly change. It's not fixed in its properties, but when we have a fusion of that ever-changing horizon and dynamic of meaning, and a fusion of our ever-changing dynamic as a viewer, when that fuses, then there is some sense proper communication. Well, I'd like to suggest something else, another way of looking at it. And first of all, I want to address the idea of the Hermeneutical Circle, because this is something that relates to the fusion of horizons. And the Hermeneutical Circle is this. Hermeneutics is the art and science of interpretation. And the Hermeneutical Circle is the idea that when you look at anything, if the thing that we're looking at, the object of what we're looking at, is perhaps in the center, we're looking and looking at it round and round in a circle, but we never get close enough to understand it entirely. We're just circling it because of all the baggage that we have and the various other things that hold us back from understanding objectively. Now, there's a lot of truth of that, and I think that postmodern theories of literary criticism and art theory has helped us to understand our frailties in these areas, which perhaps we didn't realize before. But I would like to say they've overcooked it. Now let me explain what I mean by that. Van Hooser, a great philosopher and a writer, in a book entitled The Hermeneutical Spiral, speaks of his way of understanding. And that is, instead of us circling without getting any closer to the text when we're trying to understand it, he said that there's a hermeneutical spiral. What do I mean by this? Well, as we try and dig deeper and work hard to understand the writer, the artist, the work, the context it was written in, Everything else that helps us to understand it. We may never get to understand it omnisciently, but we can get closer and closer as we home in on it. And that is why it's called the Hermeneutical Spiral. Again, we won't understand it omnisciently. There'll be things that are still somewhat opaque to us, but we can get closer enough to, in most cases, understand it well enough, if not perfectly well. Now, of course, this assumes that the artwork is static in meaning. And now I know Heidegger and Gadamer and most other people like Jacques Derrida wouldn't ascribe to that. But let's think of one thing at a time. And the hermeneutical spiral, I think, is a more accurate way of how we try and understand text. Yes, we may never understand it fully, but I think we can appreciate when we try and dig deeper and look at the context of anything, including some quite opaque poetical pieces of writing, we can understand it a little bit better. So that's one way of looking at it. I like to bring in a very well-known Canadian philosopher called Paisley Livingston, and he has got something to say related to this idea of the fixed property of the work. And again, I just want to touch on this, and we can have a look at it in a lot more detail later. But he would say that all the epistemological qualities of the work are fixed when you put down your brush. All the epistemological qualities of the work are fixed when you put down your brush. And intentists would say that the final intention is to intend no more. So when you decide to intend no more, the epistemological qualities are fixed there. And in that sense, we can believe that it has somewhat a static ontological value that we can get closer and closer to as we dig deeper with the hermeneutical spiral. Another writer, perhaps the most famous writer for those that believe intention matters, is E.D. Hirsch Jr., and he wrote a seminal book called The Validity of Interpretation, and he spoke groundbreakingly about significances, and he was saying, yes, we have baggage when we look to these different things. We do have baggage, but what we believe might be the meaning in the fact of the way it affects us emotionally and mentally. If it's not the same as the intention that's been successfully realized in the work, are significances. So you might listen to a song, or you might look at a text, and the things that make you interpret it in a certain peculiar way based on maybe your background, your childhood, things that you associated with, that wasn't the association of the text originally, or of the writer's intentions, would be what makes the work significant in your life, the significances you bring to the work. We think that's a very good way of looking at it, although we think with the arts, with more like abstract art and music, where there's not a lot of detail that could pinpoint a particular finite meaning, we think that significance is probably a term that underplays how common these things are, and how if it's intended, if the artist intends to have a work that is open to various interpretations, and that's a credible intention, then we think that another way of terming this would be the affections with an E. The affections of a work is the heart and mind, the effect of the heart and mind on the reader or the viewer from the work. And it's something that in many cases, if that's what the work is meant to be created for, that's something to celebrate and to value, not to undermine. Well, that's Critical Corner, and we'll have a look more of this later on. Next week we'll have a look a little bit more about the baggage that the artist and the writer brings to the work, rather than the hermeneutical spiral the viewer will bring. But let's move on to practice makes imperfect. Practice makes imperfect. Well, let me ask you a question. Is there any way to show that intention affects a meaning of art? Is there any way to show that my intentions affect the meaning of art? Well, let me give you a thought experiment. Is there any difference between a photo of nature and nature? Is there any difference between a realistic, photorealistic painting of nature and nature? What if the photograph and the painting were explicitly photographic, explicitly realistic, and perhaps at first glance, or even with a detailed look, you couldn't tell the difference between the two? Well, that's an imperfect analogy, but let's try and continue down this vein. What about clouds? When you see clouds in the sky and they appear to form shapes of people or buildings, or very often countries. What's the difference between that shape and the real shape? The real image that you're looking at. So going back to what we're looking at before with the photograph, we've got nature that, unless you invoke God, is something that is being created not by accident, but hasn't got a single mind dictating the image of it, and then an artist's work. You've got clouds, same thing, that are just natural forms of the air and water, and then a specific thing, a specific image. Is there any difference? Let me give you another example. Richard Dawkins, when he's arguing and discussing the nature of whether God exists or not, he's often asked, well, a lot of people naturally want to say, what is the meaning of everything? And Richard Dawkins rightly understands that the why question doesn't have any place in normal scientific discourse, that science tries to understand how. The problem is every time you ask a how question, you might say, well, why does that work? Why does that? Why? Okay, so a pen drops to the ground. How is that possible? Well, that's gravity. Well, why is there gravity? And then you have to answer with a how again. But ultimately, these why questions, why is there anything rather than nothing? Those sort of things, Richard Dawkins will understand. They're generally outside science at the moment, and he would say they're invalid questions because the scientific method is to look at what we have, not what we don't have, what we can imagine, what we have, and understand that and test that and do repeated tests that can confirm a certain hypothesis. And the reason why I bring that up is he understands that nature, what we see, if we don't invoke a God, an author, a creator of the universe, those why, what does it mean? What does nature mean? Are not genuine questions. If everything we see is just something that just formed through various chemical interactions, then we can't say why. We can talk about how, but not why, because why would need an intention, an intelligent mind behind it. So he understands that, and we need to understand and appreciate that ourselves. It's an important argument. You see, intention and the intentists, the argument is predicated on the assumption that intention imbues a thing with meaning, with additional meaning. For example, a parrot, when a parrot speaks, you understand the parrot, it communicates, but is it identical to a human who understands those words and intends to communicate something with those words? Is a parrot's words the same as a speaker who intentionally utters them? Let's have a look at a work that I've created myself to try and look at this in a creative way. The work is entitled First and Second Slip. Now that's a cricket pun, because it's a place where people field on the cricket pitch, which is just behind the batsman, hoping that they might get a catch if the bowler bowls a ball that moves away from the batsman and he snicks the ball and it can be caught behind. You have the wicket-keeper, then you have the first person who might want to catch after the wicket-keeper, and then the second, and they're called the slips. So first and second slip. It's a pun because slip is also the term related to clay. Well, what is it? Well, they're small pieces of clay, small round circular pieces of clay in the artwork. And how did I come about making this artwork? Well, a piece of clay that was wet and small when I was trying to create something, that's called slip. That fell off my station as I was creating something, fell on the floor, and it was small and very watery and slimy and circular. Unintentional, on the floor. Something that was waste, something that could be thrown away. Well, I then took another piece of clay and intentionally made it the same form, the same size, the same shape as the other bit of clay, the other slip. I molded it intentionally, creatively, purposefully to look identical. But one was waste, accident, one was carefully made with purpose and intention. But compare with the thought experiments of nature and a painting, or a real building and a cloud that may have a similar building. The look of both pieces of clay were identical in size and shape. The material was identical, which was different to the other thought experiments. and the date that they were made. One wasn't somehow created in a studio and one had been evolved over thousands of years. The date that they were made were identical as well. But one was accident, one was created to be the same as the other. So are they the same or different? Can I say one slip and a created sculpture? Or am I allowed to call the piece of work, as I did, first and second slip, by inferring that they were both the same but different? They were both slip, but one was the first and one was a second piece. How do we understand that? I would suggest that the second slip has intrinsic properties that are invisible but nevertheless there, that makes it different to the first one, because the second one was created intentionally, with purpose, with mind, with deliberation, where the first one was different. It was an accident, and yet they look identical. Practice makes imperfect. Well, that's it for this week. Slightly shorter one this week, but thank you very much for watching. Please keep watch. Next week, we look at the role of the creator. I mentioned this earlier, the role of the creator, and how modern technology like Snapchat and instant messenger cause problems for Derrida and other philosophers. It's very important, very interesting, because Derrida spoke about the privilege of speech over writing, over history, how that we have privileged speech over writing and how we've understood it. And he, in turn, turned it around and privileged writing with a lot of his works. Now, I'd like to talk about this next time, but just as a little taster, we do have a problem because of Snapchat. Now, Snapchat is an image, is the equivalent of a text, which has a permanency that Derrida was interested in, compared with the transience of speaking. And yet Snapchat, these images disappear straight away. And a lot of the stories that you have on Facebook and Instagram do the same thing. So how does that work with his theory and most people's understandings of writing being permanent and so different, and in some way something that's liable to change and keep moving, and something that we can reinterpret? Secondly, if that's images, what about instant messenger, the old instant messenger, whereby what we say and what we write can be instant and there's no delay there? Two things. Let's look at how our speech can remain permanent through these dictation apps, so that's no longer transient, and our writing and our art can be transient with various apps. It's a flip on how we've understood those two communicative properties and vehicles and modes of communication over the years. Please keep watching. Please subscribe and like these videos. Please keep the comments coming in. We get a lot of good comments, some very helpful and critical, but very helpful, asking us all sorts of things, and we try and get back to you, and we try and put some of the questions on air as well to go through them and see if we can engage with you. So please keep the comments coming in, some very positive as well. We're happy for all. As long as they are focused on the subjects and the arguments that we're presenting here, then please keep them coming in. We also have over 50 Intentist bites, which are short, mainly animated little videos between 1 and 2 minutes long on YouTube, which looks at a particularly unique theme with every video, which you can have a look at, and please subscribe to that too. And of course, we have our official Intentism website at www.intentism.org that has many things, interviews with multiple people, including Noam Chomsky and various other philosophers that are very much in the center of this kind of debate. Our artwork, music from various Intentist musicians, our plays from various actors that are involved in that movement as well. Many things that you can have a look at. Even our kind of statement of faith, our manifesto is there too. So please have a look at that. And again, goodbye. Thanks for watching and see you soon.